Akela. I'm the head of customer success engineering at Rasa, which means I'm in charge of the team of engineers that work together with our customers to bring their bots into production, and also to work on any pre-sales engineering. And yeah, so our customers are primarily in the Fortune 500 or the Global 2000s, which means on a day-to-day basis, I have a lot of different conversations with these companies. And one big topic that always comes up with them is the topic of metabots or bot orchestration. There's a lot of different terms for it. I'm not sure if you have a different one. But yeah, this topic comes up a lot. And people always want to talk about this really early on and see this as a solution to a bunch of different problems that they have. And I personally don't always agree that this should be the solution for everything. So that's why I have this title for my talk, Metabots, Why They're Probably Not the Solution to Your Problems. So I want to talk about all the problems and solutions there are out there to help you best deal with these. So what I want you to get out of this talk, I want you all to have an overview of the problems that users may encounter when scaling a bot to more than one user goal. And I also want you to get a picture of what solutions there are to address each of these different problems. So by the end of this talk, you should basically have all the information you need to make a decision on which approach to use for your individual bots. So before I start going into the details of all this, I just want to cover some definitions of words that I'm going to be using a lot so that we're all on the same page. So when I say the word or term user goal, what I mean here is a goal that a user wants to accomplish when they're talking to a bot. So in this situation here, we have an example of a financial services bot, and the user goal in this case is wanting to transfer money to a friend. Then one bot can, of course, consist of one or more user goals, which can be across one or multiple domains. So in the example on the right here, we have two user goals. We have the transferring money one I just talked about, and also checking the account balance. So in this case, that's two user goals in one domain, which is the financial one. Then another term is context switching. This is when a user switches between different user goals in the middle of a conversation or in one conversation. So for example, here, the user has started the transferring money user goal. The bot asks the user a bunch of questions around that, but the user then changes their mind and wants to know their account balance before transferring money. So that's what we call context switching. And there's different ways a bot can handle this. The final one I want to explain is intent overlap. So what I mean here is when two intents that have really similar examples cause the model to be confused about the prediction. So that basically means that either will predict the wrong intents for certain things or just have a very low confidence on this. So on the example on the right, we have the intent view bank statement and the intent view credit card statement. As you might see, these examples are all very similar to each other. In fact, they're pretty much the same sentence apart from the one word bank, which can be interchanged with credit card. So these are super similar in this case, and that might cause some confusion in the NLU model. So that's what I mean with intent overlap, also commonly referred to as intent confusion. All right, so yeah, when you are first building off your bot, that process is relatively simple. I'm not saying bot building itself is simple. I'm just saying that at the beginning, there's a lot less challenges. So just to give you a picture of this, you are one team with a few people on it, and you want to build a financial bot with one user goal. So yeah, you're just kind of defining all the things that go around that. There's relatively few challenges there from anyone else. So that just starts off really simple. Then as you add more of these user goals, you may have some more problems or anticipate some problems. So like I said, we started off with the user goal of checking the balance of your account. There's one team working on this. but then say a second team comes in that wants to work on a skill for or user goal for money transfers. So at this point, you have two teams working on this, trying to do two different user goals. And at this point, you might think, okay, there are some problems we're running into now, or problems you may anticipate in future. So I want to now cover some of these problems that you might encounter or anticipate during this whole process. And in general, there are two categories of these problems that you might anticipate or encounter. I keep saying encounter or anticipate because a lot of these problems are problems that you will actually run into at some point. Others are ones that you worry about at the beginning and kind of think you'll run into, so you already try to think of all these solutions. And so the two categories of the problems are providing the user with the best experience, so making sure the bot is user-friendly and so on. And the other one is organizational challenges around building your bot. So I'm going to go around through all of these in a bit more detail. So yeah, like I said, the first category is around user experience. So just making the experience for the user as seamless as possible. This is super important generally when building your bot. And when you are building either two bots or two user goals, you may think, okay, I can deploy these in different ways. For example, you could put one bot on the website, you could put another one in your mobile app to kind of make those accessible in different places. But at this point, you may think, okay, but then the user has to remember where to find these bots, what these individual bots can do, and they're probably going to forget this, right? Because you're not going to check the website and the app all the time to figure out which bot should do what. So at this point, you think, okay, if I'm adding more user goals, they should probably be accessible in one place just to make it easier. So they have one UI in your mobile app, and they can just ask for anything that they need in this place. So when you've decided that, there's also certain things to take into consideration here. So what I specifically want to mention is guiding the user. So you can ask a really open-ended question to the user at the beginning. Like you can say, hi, I'm the banking bot, how can I help? And then let the user basically decide what they want to do. That might work, but it's also relatively error prone. Like the user may phrase this in a way that the bot doesn't understand. The user may also not know what the bot can do. And so you can end up in situations where the bot either does something wrong or just says, sorry, I didn't understand that. So the easier thing to do is the situation on the right, add some buttons, for example. Just make it clear to the user that there's two things this bot can do. It can transfer money and it can check balance. And that way that a user will directly know what they should do and can also phrase it in a way that the bot will know what the user means. So the other category of problems are the organizational challenges. So one thing that happens quite a lot is that you have multiple different teams in your organization working on different user goals. And this might cause some problems for you. So you might have two different teams, they're in charge of maintaining two different user goals, and they might get into each other's way or not know what the other's bot already does, and there might just be some confusion around around who should be doing what, who should have access to that, to what. Then another one is preventing changes to one user goal influencing another one. So a concern I come across often is that you've built one user goal that works fine. Now someone else is adding a new one. How do you make sure that the original one still works and the new one doesn't also still works? So you basically don't want to end up in a situation where the bot is responding, your balance is $1,000 to a transfer money question. Then around the topic of NLU models, people often think that there are going to be too many intents for a single NLU model to handle. So as you're building more user goals, you're adding more and more intents to your bot, and therefore more and more training data. And so you might think, okay, at some point I'll hit a number of like 100 or 200 intents, and then you wonder, right, is my NLU model actually still going to be able to handle this? So related to the question of too many intents is training time for your model. So whether you're increasing the number of intents as you build user goals, or whether you're just getting more and more NLU examples, or also conversation flows, at some point the training time of your model might get quite long. And so you might end up with like an error, like in the skip4, it just takes way too long for your model to train for you to make updates as fast as you want them to happen. Right, and the final problem I want to talk about is sharing data across different bots. So you might be building a bunch of different bots, maybe ones that are even unrelated to each other, and there are typically some user goals that you want them all to have. They should all have this, and you shouldn't have to write additional training data for them to be able to handle that. So for example, you might have a greet intent and a goodbye intent, and you want these bots to be able to handle them in the same way and not have to, not have any additional work to get the bot to do this. Cool. So now that I've talked about all of these problems, those are just the ones that have come up most in conversations with these bigger companies in the global 2000s. Now I want to talk about some solutions that have come from both our customers, but also from ourselves that we've looked into and kind of dug into. So yeah, I'm going to cover a bunch of those. Yeah, so for each of these problems, there is one or more solutions to them. And there's a long list of problems. There's also a longer list of solutions. And yeah, not every problem is addressed by the same solution. So I'm going to cover that one by one. But one thing to keep in mind as well is that some of these problems being addressed also kind of depend on how you design your bot. So the good user experience, for example, is possible in technically all of these solutions. But if if at the beginning you don't design your bot well, then none of these approaches will solve the problem either. So you kind of need to make sure that you're actually paying attention to user experience as you go on. None of these are just going to automatically solve that for you. Yeah, and each of these solutions I'm going to talk about, they will be combining your bots or user goals at different building steps. So a very high level process of what bot building usually looks like is you first write some code or training data, conversation flows, etc. You then train the model in some sort of continuous integration that you have set up, and ideally also run some tests. And that then gets deployed to a server and put out to your users. So this is quite high level. Obviously, realistically, there's a lot more steps involved, but I just want to be able to illustrate at which point these solutions combine your bots into one, or Cool. So the first solution I want to talk about is building a single bot. So the problem that addresses is good user experience and user goal interference. So what I mean with building a single bot is exactly that. It's nothing complicated. It's a really simple approach. You're basically just adding all the user goals that you want to build to a single bot rather than building multiple. And so this approach makes a lot of sense when there's a small number of related user goals. So for example, we've been taking the example of the financial bot the whole time. That might have some user goals like transferring money, checking your account balance, and changing your address in your bank account. In that case, it makes total sense for this to all just be one bot, live in the same GitHub repository, and just, not have that split up at all. So in this case, your user goals will be merged during the coding part of your bot. So obviously there's no actual merging happening since you're already writing it this way. It's just the way you write it. And there is both advantages and disadvantages to this approach. So of course, this is going to be the most simple option in terms of a deployment architecture. You will just be deploying this model on one virtual machine or wherever you choose to deploy this. So that'll be relatively straightforward. And this also means that you can easily set it up so that your users can access everything from one UI. There's nothing fancy that needs to be done there. Another important part of building a bot is testing it, making sure that it works from the beginning to finish. So basically checking that the NLU model is predicting your intents correctly, but also that the bot is predicting which action to take next correctly. And so that's what we call end-to-end testing of the bot. So in the case of a single bot, you can easily just write these end-to-end tests and run them as part of your continuous integration. So in Rasa, there is a format that we call end-to-end testing that you can write and just provide for the testing script to run through when you're running your CI. I'm sure this method also exists in other tools. But the point is, this is just really simple to do when you just have one bot. And with these end-to-end tests, you can then also ensure that these user goals aren't influencing each other. If you're always running these tests at every point of the way, when you're adding new user goals, then you can always make sure that nothing is breaking. Some disadvantages here are that training times might become a bit long at some point. So as you add more user goals to this bot, you will at some point hit a stage where you have like a lot of NLU examples, a lot of intents, many different conversation flows you need to train your bot on. And then your model might end up taking like 10 hours or something to train. So that's something that you may encounter when building a single bot at some point. Yeah, the other disadvantage is that everyone will have to use the same GitHub repository or wherever else you're working on your bot. It'll all live in the same place, and this might not be a problem for you if you're a smaller organization that consists of, well, not an organization. If you're just one small team of 2 people, then this probably isn't a concern to you. But if you are, say, 2 teams of multiple people, then you maybe don't want them all to have access to the same stuff. So that is something that you may run into if you're in that situation in a larger organization. Yeah. Then the next solution I want to talk about is merging bots at training time. So this also addresses the first 2, sorry, not the first 2, it addresses the same problems as the previous solution. In addition to that, it also addresses the problem of having multiple teams working on one bot. And so what I mean with merging bots at training time, here I just mean you are building your bots, your 2 bots or your 2 user goals completely separately in 2 separate repositories, maybe 2 different teams or the same team, that's up to you. So say you have one bot for transferring money and another one for loan queries. So you build those separately, maintain them separately, but then when you run the training process as part of your CI, then at this point, all that data will get merged together so that you have one big model that the user then talks to. So yeah, as the title indicates, the bots in this case get merged at training time. So the benefits in this case, a lot of these are the same as in the single bot situation, because in the end, this method does just end up being one bot at the end. So again, you have a simple deployment architecture, which means users can easily access everything from one UI. You can easily set it up that way. And end-to-end testing can also be done in the same way that you could with a single bot. So yeah, you can write these end-to-end tests as part of the individual user goals or bots separately, but you can also write ones that will combine the 2 to make sure that those don't influence each other. And then in addition to these existing pros, you can also separately maintain your individual bots in this situation. So this addresses the issue of having multiple teams work on a bot. They can do that completely separately, don't have to interact with each other. And yeah, people that shouldn't have access to one goal don't have to have access to that. Some cons here are that the training times might become longer again. This is the same as in the single bot situation. As you add more and more goals and you're merging more and more bots, then at some point your model may take too long to train, and that might not be ideal for your situation. And another con here is that there might be some intent overlap that you have to deal with. So there might be some confusion in your model. Since you are merging intents from different bots, then yeah, you know, there might be some intents that are named differently, but actually mean the same thing, which will be an issue when predicting an intent on a user's message. So yeah, that's something you'll run into here. But on the other hand, this is also somewhat a benefit of this approach, because you can, when you're running these tests during your CI, which you always should, it should actually raise these issues. So you should be able to see that there's two intents that are super confused with each other. And so you should be able to address that. And this isn't the case with some of the methods I'm going to talk about afterwards. And yeah, just to mention, in the Rasa open source framework, we actually have a component for this called the multi-project importer. So you can try that out yourself as well. If you take a look at the docs, it's completely customizable as well. So we kind of have an out-of-the-box solution for that. But generally, this method should be applicable to other bots as well if they allow for it. Cool. And yeah, the next solution is metabot routing. So this is the one that everyone always loves to talk to me about. They always say, hey, how do we do this? So yeah, I'm gonna talk about some solutions there. So the problems that this addresses is all the ones of the previous one and also the long training times. Yeah, and so the idea with metabot routing here is that you host the individual bots separately, and you have a routing system to send the user to these separate bots. So you basically have one main bot, as you can see here, that then decides where the user should be sent based on what they have said. And so in this situation, there's two main options. You can either go with an approach where the user input runs to the main bot at every step of the way, or you can use the approach where the main bot will just hand off to a subbot, and then the user just stays there until the flow is completed. So to talk about the first option, we're talking about the main bot handling the user input at each turn. So the way this happens is that the individual subbots are hosted separately. Their models are hosted somewhere in the cloud probably. And in addition to that, you will train one big main NLU model, which contains all the subbot intents. Then the routing process works in a sequence of steps. So first, the user says something that gets sent to the main bot. The main bot will parse the user message. And then based on the intent recognized there, it will send the user to a subbot. Then once this has happened, the same process kind of happens the whole time. So the user, each time they say something, the message will once again be parsed through the main bot and then sent to whichever subbot it should be. And so, of course, that's quite, it's quite tricky, but the idea is that once one of these main subbot intents has been identified, the user continues to get routed to the subbot, in this case, the financial bot, until an intent from a different bot is recognized, at which point it might route them to the other one. So the second approach is that the main bot will just hand off the user to a subbot and have them stay there. So what I forgot to mention is the other approach that I just talked about. Since the user goes through the main bot each time, it will allow you to do some context switching. So if the user is if the user is going through one user goal, but then decides to do something else midway, then you can, since the user's message is parsed by the main bot each time, then you can do this. You can route them to somewhere else just mid-conversation. You can't do that in this method, and I'll tell you why. So the idea here, again, is that you host the individual bots separately with their models somewhere in the cloud or wherever else. And then you train one main NLU model that consists only of the main subbot intents. So really only the intents that actually take care of activating a certain user goal. And then the routing process here will work as follows. The user message gets parsed by the main bot. Based on the intent that is recognized, the user is then routed to a subbot. Then any subsequent messages the user sends will be sent directly to the subbot until the user is finished with their goal. Once that's done, the bot will hand off the user back to the main bot, and they can then pick something new there. And that process then kind of continues. And yeah, so like I said, in this case, context switching wouldn't really be possible because you are just kind of ignoring any attempts of the user to switch conversations, since they just have access directly to the financial bot once they're in there. Cool. So generally speaking, bot routing introduces a lot of complexity. So the merging process in this case happens in the server stage of your development process or deployment process. And yeah, there's a lot of complexity there. So you can see there's a pretty long con list here. But before I talk about all the ways that this causes problems, I'll talk about the benefits first. So yeah, one benefit here is that the bots can be maintained separately. So you can maintain these in different GitHub repositories, have different teams access them. That can be done completely separately here. And the other thing is that your deployment times may be quicker. And so what I mean here is that if you make a small change to one of the user goals or one of the subbots, then you can just retrain this one model and push that out quickly rather than having to retrain one giant model like in the merging at training time case, for example. But with that, there comes a lot of disadvantages. So like I already mentioned, context switching is going to become quite tricky. In the second bot routing option, it's not really possible at all because you kind of just assume the user is going to finish their user goal. In the first option, it is possible, but it's very error prone because you kind of have to decide on how you're going to handle a bunch of different things. Like, do you pass on the conversation history from one bot to the next or not? So that just becomes a lot more complicated. Then, like I already mentioned a lot of times, testing is super important, making sure your bot works from start to finish. That's going to be a lot more difficult in this scenario as well. Because there's all this routing stuff involved, you can't just write these simple end-to-end tests anymore. You have to make sure that kind of routing system works and that the bot just gets sent to these different subbots consistently. So this just makes it a lot more complicated. And because the user goals of these bots will probably change a lot since you're making a lot of update, that makes that even trickier. Then if you're also using the approach of learning from real user data when developing your bot, then that process becomes trickier as well. So we always say, look at what your users are saying, add that to your training data, kind of adapt your bot based on what's happening there. And if you're doing this with the bot routing approach, there's a lot of issues that come into play here. So at this point, you're going to have to decide, okay, if the user says something, which bot does this actually belong to? Is it one of the subbots? Should this go in the main bots model? And you also have to think how you're going to name this intent to match up with the different subbots. So this just it makes that whole process a lot more difficult. Then the final one is that debugging your bot locally becomes a lot trickier as well. Like I said, there's a lot of routing setup involved there. You're probably not going to have that running on your local machine, so you can't just look at the logs of one bot. You kind of have to, investigate what the path the user took and how that was handled and so on. So that it just also becomes trickier. Cool. Yeah, so now that I've talked about all those solutions, I just want to finish off with one for completeness. So building separate bots. This is slightly different to the other ones because it doesn't actually assume the user accesses the bot from one UI, but I just want to mention this for completeness. Building separate bots kind of speaks for itself, but the idea is that you maintain your bots separately, but you also host them completely separately. So there's actually no interaction between them whatsoever, no meta bot, no bot routing, nothing. And this makes sense for situations where you want your user to access the bot from different places. So a good example of that would be a bot for sales inquiries that you want to have on your website. Users that are browsing your website will probably want to ask questions there. And then you can have a bot for users that are logged into your mobile app, for example, to ask questions about their finances. So in that case, it's better to just have them separate. You don't need to do any sort of interaction between them all. All right, and now I've talked about most of these problems, but there's two that I haven't actually addressed. So there's the problem of too many intents and sharing data across bots. And the reason I haven't addressed them is that because while these problems are associated with meta bots or multiple bots, I actually don't think that any of the solutions that I've described are a solution to those problems. So the problem of having too many intents for a single NLU model to handle. Realistically, from my experience with building bots myself and talking to companies, large companies as well, it's unlikely that this is going to become an issue for a long time. You really have to add a lot of new user goals, lots of intents for this to actually become a problem. And even when it does become a problem, it's possible that there's other solutions to the problem. In fact, it's extremely likely that there's other solutions. It could be that your intents are way too fine-grained, for example, and that's not something having multiple bots is going to fix. Because if you have multiple bots, you still have a lot of intents. They're just like artificially separated. So this is something to be addressed in a different way, and you shouldn't use one of these solutions to fix that. Then the other problem of sharing data between different bots. So making sure they can just perform some generic user goals that all bots should be able to perform. I would say that's also a different problem. So while it is associated with the topic of building multiple bots, this is less about having the user be able to access a bot from the same UI, but more about like kind of the building process of it. And so that would be addressed not with any of these methods I just mentioned, but for example, by sharing a bot template across your organization. All right, so as to conclude this whole thing, you're probably wondering, okay, got all this information now, which one should I choose? So I'll start with the two most obvious ones. If you're building bots that are run on separate UIs, then of course you should build separate bots. There's no need for any complexity, just do that. Keep it as simple as possible. Then if you have a relatively small number of related user goals, just build one bot. Again, keep it simple. Keeping it simple is the best thing to do for as long as you can. So I say relatively small here because I don't mean like 3 or 4. I mean however many you can add without actually running into problems. Yeah, the longer you can stick with just one bot, the simpler things are going to be for you. But then you may, so like I said, you may run into some problems at some point where you feel your bot can become unmanageable. So the two main examples of this would be that your training times are becoming too long to push frequent updates. So you want to, you want to update your bot daily or something, but your model takes like 12 hours to train. So that would be a good reason to go away from those approaches. The other one is certain teams only having access to certain user goals. So yeah, if there's one team working on one user goal, they shouldn't be able to change the other one, and you don't want them to get into each other's way. So having a way to separate out their work. So when you notice these things happen, then there are two options you can choose from. There's the option of merging at training time and the bot routing option. So now you have to decide between those two. Yeah, so there are 3 main factors that you should consider when making this decision. I'm going to say there's not one solution that just fits all. It really depends on what's important to you and the use case and what your bot building process looks like and so on. So the first one is the ease of end-to-end testing. So like I said, how easy is it to actually write these end-to-end tests for your bot? How easy is it to make sure that the bot performs as it should when adding new things? So, I mean, I would say testing is a pretty important thing that you should always cover. Yeah, in this case, end-to-end testing, like I said, is easier in the merging at training time approach. So that's probably the one you should go for if testing is super important to you. Then the next one to consider is the deployment times when you're updating your bots. So if you want to be able to make updates to your bot more frequently, and if that's really important to you, but your training times are too long, then at this point you could consider going down the bot routing option. So yeah, if you're, because merging at training time, you could run into the problem that your bot takes 10 hours to train or something. So that might be when you think of bot routing. Then the final one is how important it is to you that the user is able to context switch. So like I already mentioned, this is really easily doable in the merging at training time option. You can just define some conversation flows for that, but it's a lot more difficult in the bot routing scenario. So one approach can do it, the other one can't do it at all, but it's generally just way easier in the merging at training time approach. And related to that, if you do go for bot routing, I would say still choose the simpler option. Like rather than just allowing the user to context switch at any point, you should go for maybe a simpler option, because doing that is quite error prone. Like I mentioned earlier, you kind of have to take a lot of things into consideration, like passing conversation history from one bot to the other and so on. There's a lot of things that can go wrong there. So going for a simpler option might be that you still want to let them pick another bot when they're in a sub-bot, and you could do that by offering a button to return to the main menu or main bot, for example. Or you could also just let them, leave them in the one bot to complete that user goal and then return back. But the whole, whichever option it is, the simpler one is always better. Yeah, and just to close all of this off, I've given you a lot of information about problems and solutions now. I think whichever option you choose, it's always important that you think about the user experience first. When you're building a bot, super important that your bot is user-friendly and that the user can just interact with it as seamlessly as possible. And so any organizational challenges you have should come second. So yeah, I hope I've given you enough information now on all these different solutions and that you now know which approach could work for you. So yeah, thank you for listening. I am doing a live Q&A after this, so if you have any questions for me, then please join me there and I will try to answer them. And yeah, if there's anything that you can't ask now but want to ask me later, also feel free to get in touch with me via email. Thank you.